The park security guard's voice cuts through the morning air like a blade. "Hey, old man, you can't sleep here anymore. People are complaining about the smell." 83-year-old Frank Morrison slowly sits up on the wooden bench, his weathered hands trembling as joggers and dog walkers stare with disgust. What none of them see is the faded Ranger tab sewn inside his torn jacket pocket. If stories like Frank's remind you why we must never forget our heroes, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments. Have you ever witnessed someone being judged without knowing their true story? Your support helps me share more of these powerful veteran stories that need to be heard. Frank had been sleeping on that same bench in Riverside Park for 3 weeks. His gray beard was tangled and dirty. His clothes hadn't been washed in days, and his warm boots had holes that let the cold seep through to his bones. To everyone passing by, he looked like just another homeless person they wished would disappear. The security guard, a young man named Kevin, stood over Frank with his arms crossed. His radio crackled as other guards reported in from different parts of the park. Kevin's voice grew louder and more aggressive as a small crowd began to gather. "Move along, sir. You're making families uncomfortable. This is a public park, not a hotel." Frank slowly stood up, his joints aching from sleeping on the hard bench. He didn't argue or fight back. He simply nodded and began gathering his few belongings: a torn backpack, a water bottle, and an old newspaper he used as a blanket. But Kevin wasn't done. He seemed to enjoy having an audience of morning joggers and dog walkers who had stopped to watch the scene. His voice carried across the park as he continued his verbal assault. "Look at this guy," Kevin said, pointing at Frank like he was some kind of exhibit. "Every morning it's the same thing. First, it was the bench by the fountain, then the one by the playground. Now he's here stinking up the place where kids play." A woman in expensive jogging gear wrinkled her nose and pulled her small dog closer to her legs. "These people need to find somewhere else to go," she muttered to her friend. "It's not safe having them around children." An older man in a business suit checked his expensive watch and shook his head. "The city needs to do something about this problem. I pay taxes to use this park, not to step over vagrants." Frank's face burned with shame, but he kept his head down and continued packing his things. His hands shook not just from the cold morning air, but from the humiliation of being treated like garbage in front of so many people. Kevin stepped closer, his voice getting nastier. "You know what, old man? I'm tired of chasing you around this park every few days. Maybe it's time we called the police and let them deal with you properly." The crowd murmured their approval. Several people had pulled out their phones and were recording the confrontation. Frank could hear their comments getting more cruel by the minute. "Look how dirty he is," one person whispered. "Probably drunk or on drugs," said another. "Someone should call social services," added a third voice. Frank finished packing his backpack and slung it over his shoulder. The weight of it, combined with his age and the arthritis in his back, made him wince. But he still didn't say a word in his own defense. Kevin wasn't satisfied with just getting Frank to leave. He seemed determined to make an example out of him in front of the growing crowd of onlookers. "You know what your problem is?" Kevin said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You people think the world owes you something. You think you can just take whatever you want without contributing anything to society." A jogger in the crowd called out his agreement. "He's right. These homeless people are everywhere now. They need to get jobs and stop being a burden on the rest of us." Frank stopped walking and turned slightly, his weathered face showing just a hint of the pain those words caused. But he still didn't respond. He had learned long ago that fighting back would only make things worse. Kevin saw Frank's reaction and pressed harder. "What's wrong, old man? Got nothing to say for yourself? Can't defend your lazy lifestyle?" The woman with the dog spoke up again. "It's disgusting how they just expect handouts. When I was young, people had pride and worked for what they needed." Frank began walking toward the park exit, but Kevin followed him, continuing his public shaming. The crowd moved with them like they were watching some kind of street performance. "Look at him run away," Kevin announced to his audience. "Can't even face the truth about what he is." Just then, a man in his early 40s, wearing a navy sweatshirt and running shorts, jogged up to the group. He had been doing his morning run when he heard the commotion from across the park. Something about the way the old man carried himself, even bent over with shame, caught his attention. The Navy veteran, Marcus Chun, pushed through the crowd and got his first clear look at Frank's face. What he saw made his blood run cold and his heart race at the same time. The tired eyes, beset of the jaw, the way Frank held his shoulders despite his age and condition. Marcus had seen those same features in a faded photograph that hung in the Navy SEAL training facility. A photograph of legends, of men who had done impossible things in impossible places. Marcus stepped forward, and his voice cut through Kevin's continued insults like a knife through butter. "Excuse me," he said, his tone firm but respectful. "I think you might want to reconsider how you're talking to this gentleman." Kevin turned around, annoyed at being interrupted. "And who are you supposed to be? This doesn't concern you, buddy." Marcus ignored Kevin completely and approached Frank directly. He studied the old man's face for another moment, comparing it to memories of stories he'd heard and pictures he'd seen during his own military training. "Sir," Marcus said quietly, his voice filled with growing recognition and respect. "Were you by any chance in Vietnam? Specifically, were you with the 75th Ranger Regiment?" Frank looked up for the first time during the entire confrontation. His tired eyes met Marcus's steady gaze, and something passed between them that the crowd couldn't understand. "Long time ago," Frank said simply. His voice was rough from disuse and emotion. Marcus's face went pale. He took a step back and then did something that shocked everyone in the park, including Frank. He stood at attention and gave Frank a crisp military salute. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced to the confused crowd, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to command. "You are in the presence of Sergeant First Class Frank Morrison, recipient of 2 Purple Hearts, a Silver Star, and the Medal of Honor." The park went completely silent. Even Kevin's radio seemed to stop crackling. Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger and more emotional with each word. This man didn't just serve his country, he saved it. In 1968, during the Tet Offensive, Sergeant Morrison single-handedly held off an entire North Vietnamese company for 6 hours while his wounded squad was evacuated. Frank's eyes filled with tears, but he remained standing straight. He was shot 4 times. Marcus went on, but he kept fighting until every one of his men was safe. The citation for his Medal of Honor reads that his actions were above and beyond the call of duty and showed complete disregard for his own safety in service to his brothers and his country. The crowd began to shift uncomfortably. The woman with the dog had put her phone away and was staring at Frank with a completely different expression. Marcus wasn't finished. After Vietnam, Sergeant Morrison came home to protests and people spitting on soldiers at airports. He never talked about what he did over there. He just went to work, raised a family, and served his community for 50 years. Kevin had gone completely quiet, his face red with embarrassment, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Frank finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "My wife died 2 years ago. Cancer treatments took everything we had. Lost the house 6 months later. Haven't been the same since." The businessman in the expensive suit stepped forward. "Sir," he said, his voice completely different from the harsh tone he'd used earlier. "I had no idea. Is there anything ... What can we do to help?" Frank shook his head slowly. "Don't need pity. Just needed a place to sleep that was safe." Marcus pulled out his phone and started making calls right there in the park. Within minutes, he had contacted 3 different veteran support organizations and arranged temporary housing for Frank at a facility that specialized in helping older veterans get back on their feet. But the most important moment came when Marcus walked over to Kevin, who was standing alone now that the crowd had dispersed, most of them looking ashamed of how they had acted. "You know what the real tragedy is?" Marcus asked Kevin. "This man would have given his life for any one of us, including you. And we treated him like garbage because he was down on his luck." Kevin nodded, tears in his eyes. "I didn't know," he whispered. Marcus put his hand on Kevin's shoulder. "None of us knew. But now we do. And now we have a chance to do better." 3 months later, Frank Morrison moved into a small apartment subsidized by a veterans organization. He had regular meals, clean clothes, and most importantly, his dignity restored. Marcus visited him every week, and they became close friends despite the age difference. Frank never asked for recognition or special treatment because of his military service. He had spent 50 years after Vietnam just trying to live a normal life and serve his community in quiet ways. But sometimes life has other plans. The story of that morning in the park spread through social media and local news. Soon, people from across the country were sending letters and donations to help Frank and other veterans like him. But Frank always said the most important thing that came from that terrible morning wasn't the help he received. It was the reminder that you never know who the person next to you really is or what they've been through. The park bench where Frank used to sleep now has a small plaque that reads, "In honor of all veterans who served with courage and came home to serve with humility." And Kevin, he left his security job and went to work for the same veterans organization that helped Frank. He said he wanted to spend his life making up for that one morning when he forgot that every person has value and dignity, regardless of their circumstances. Frank Morrison lived for 5 more years after that morning in the park. He passed away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by the friends and community he had found in his final years. At his funeral, Marcus read from Frank's Medal of Honor citation, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The last thing Frank ever said to Marcus was this: "The real heroes never made it home from Vietnam. I was just lucky enough to get a second chance to remember what it means to be treated with kindness. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons. Sometimes they're fought with recognition, respect, and the simple act of seeing the human being behind the circumstances." Frank Morrison fought both kinds of battles, and he won them both.